kind of the beginning of written history. And in pop culture, it's there as well. So it's strange. It's like it keeps popping up. And then, someone like David Icke, who helped kind of make this theory popular, he gets bashed, of course, but it's funny how almost everything he was talking about is true. It's been kind of proven true, except for this one thing, which I don't know. I mean, like his record's pretty spot on, but here's the thing though, this reptilian presence, if it is in an interdimensional form or a 4D form, the government's known there's beyond the spectrums of light, understand? Like, so they've known this for a long time. So if they're just kind of emitting new light forms and new wavelengths, whatever, so who's to say that, that there's alien entities that exist in these forms that we just can't see? Now, then you have the physical presence, and I've always kind of wondered and made it look like where, okay, you have the physical presence. I think that might have died down, because if there was an interdimensional and a physical, maybe it just switched to interdimensional over time. Or it could be two different things. I mean, it could be just two different reptilian species in general, right? It doesn't mean there has to be only one form of reptilian species. What if there's many?
Right.
So you get into the Sinclair family with the dinosaur, right? The Sinclairs are from the Knights Templar.
Yeah, they had the Sinclair gas station, which had the dinosaur logo and oftentimes like a dinosaur statue out front.
Yep. Very cool. Very cool. Very weird, though.
Yeah.
Why?
Reptilian.
Of all the things to choose, like, why that? Yeah. Very, very strange. So you have these things, and then you have the Muppets, right? Not the Muppets, but Jim Henson. He created the show, the dinosaur show.
Right, that 90s sitcom.
The 90s sitcom. It was huge. Very popular.
Not the Mama.
So they have this whole thing Jim Henson helped create, right? But before that, he was negotiating a deal with Disney about the Muppets, his most cherished creation. And he didn't want to give up control. So basically, he told him, it's not going to happen. And he died like the next day of a heart attack.
Right.
And they got control anyways. So, I mean, that's how it is. But you look at the connection with these things, and he was a Hollywood insider. So he had to kind of been maybe throwing out there that with this dinosaur show, showing these upright, walking, talking dinosaur aliens, working class dinosaur aliens, having the same sort of lives that we're kind of stuck in, right? Having to work, the banking and all those things were contained within that show. So it's very interesting. So you get the Sinclairs, and they're the ones who have the Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. And that chapel has, images of corn, crazy things they couldn't have known, which was before Columbus's trip, right? So there's that whole theory that the Templars came over here before in the 1300s or 1400s. And if you look at the Rosslyn Chapel, you'll find imagery of this. And it's strange because later on they have this Sinclair, and we know like Lord Byron supposedly had reptilian.
Really?
So there is the element of in the 1400s, 1500s, 16, even going up into the Victorian era of the physical traits of some reptilians still being around.
Damn.
It wasn't far removed from going hunting the dragons, right? The knights going hunting the dragons. What does that mean?
Yeah, and their dragons are always guarding a lot of wealth, a big pile of gold or some shit.
Oh, exactly. You kill the dragon and get all the treasure.
Yeah, man. That's awesome. And I do just love that story about Jim Henson and the dinosaurs. Like, he knew the truth and wanted to somehow mock them in mainstream media. Just all the reptilian connections in general. It does make you wonder. We even noted last time that the most famous video game ever, Mario, is about battling a family of crown-wearing reptiles. And it's not conclusive, but it's very clearly in the cultural memory. And I used to be very into this idea of aliens from another planet coming down and hooking us up with a societal jumpstart, for better or worse. But now I actually think contact that it might be like shamanic journeying or, tapping into that astral plane, because that was big in those ancient times. And I think that type of contact and influence is a bit more likely than a ship landing somewhere on the Giza Plateau. these tools and systems of control could just as easily pass from some reptilian archonic beings to an elite priesthood like the Shemsu Hor by more esoteric means than physical, kind of like you were suggesting before.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we have so many references and so much historical, conundrums that deal with this topic. I'm just going to go through, I have a list right here, just the pop culture alone with the reptilians. Yeah, King Koopa from Mario Brothers, and you got the Slee Stacks from Land of the Lost. Rowdy Piper, he was fighting They Live, and They Live, right? Which is, They Live is probably one of the greatest movies ever made.
Yeah.
I mean, the score is fabulous. Everything about it. I mean, it's literally like a documentary. It's like, whoa. It basically explains why John Carpenter, that was basically into him. He kind of got mad at him for that. So, and then, Rowdy Piper was also in Hell Comes to Frogtown. I don't know if anyone remembers that one, but it's horrible 80s movie. Oh, it's great. It's super corny. It's like one of those, might even be one of those trauma movies, Traumaville or whatever, that did Toxic Avenger and all that. So basically, Rowdy Piper has to fight the reptilian, frog monsters in this post-apocalyptic world. It's worth watching. It's pretty funny. And then you got Enemy Mine, right? Dennis Quaid, Louis Gossett Jr. plays the reptilian, and they're basically from Draco, like fighting. It's kind of like we're in space in the future fighting these reptilians from Draco. That was a movie in the 80s. There's an interesting movie called Dreamscape with Dennis Quaid again, and it's also from the 80s. And he's involved in a CIA psychic experiment. He ends up doing battle with like a shape-shifting reptilian, who's one of the main bad guys in the movie. So it's very strange, very strange. And then we have Conan the Barbarian, of course, Thulsa Doom.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure everyone's kind of familiar with Thulsa Doom. And then you have Babylon 5. There's the Narns in Babylon 5. You got V, which is one of my favorite series, also from the 80s. And then you can get into the comic books. You got the Amazing Spider-Man with Dr. Kirk Connors, who was reptilian, right? So
yeah, the lizard.
Yep, and Fantastic Four. The Sauron and the X-Men, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, of course. Just on and on and on and on. G.I. Joe. Oh my God! If you watch episodes of G.I. Joe, it just blow your mind, man. It's
really
ridiculous. You should start watching it. It's incredible. It's literally like, who was this written for? It's all about the New World Order. It's all about banking and the Illuminati and cult, and every kind of little clue that we know now is already implanted in us, basically. Like, we were predictive programmed this since children. We didn't even know it. Yeah, G.I. Joe's insane. It's crazy.
Well, that is quite a lot. It's definitely a major theme. And in terms of that idea that reptilians would have to be physical, I do think the more nuanced understanding is that this cultural memory, or this connection between the elite and something reptilian, is more magical or ritual based, because it makes sense. The connection between occultists and banking has always been fairly strong. It was always this priest class. And then we have stories about the Knights Templar and their connection to Baphomet, another possible entity that they got banking practices from. And I don't know how you really craft a fractional reserve system of creating something out of nothing and get everyone to buy into it without some type of spell, because we all seem pretty bound and mesmerized by it.
Oh, I mean, it's right there on the dollar bill, man. It's right there, all the witchcraftery,
the sigils,
and symbolism. Yeah, it's there. So, well, think about it. I mean, you're only as free as the dollars in your pocket. So, yeah, we're kind of, all of us, and this is why things really don't get done on certain levels, and that's why it's kind of disappointing to see Trump just make a 180 on basically everything. It's like, either he's a complete con man, or he got in there and realized, like, I mean, what can you do? Like the deep, like Ron Paul. I mean, Ron Paul is the real president. Let's just be honest, man. Like, he's been saying this for decades, right? And he said, you can vote all you want, the deep state won't change. And then you don't only have to worry about the deep, because the deep state really could care less. I mean, they got off-world technologies. They got all these anti-gravity crafts. I mean, they got the whole, if they are going to Mars via, wormhole technology, who knows, man? We don't know what they know. You understand? Like, there's our world, and there's like their world, that the real world that we have no idea about.
Well, that's interesting you bring up Trump in that way, because I noticed that your most recent book is called The Donald Trump Conspiracy: How a Billionaire Businessman Challenged the New World Order. And those are exactly the kind of questions I had, because now that he's staying in NAFTA, expanding the war, backtracking on NATO being
Exactly.
obsolete,
Right.
insider
Right.
dealing. I obviously hated Hillary, and I was glad when I saw something like the TPP get shot down, but I still
Of
really in
course.
my heart of hearts thought of Trump as a guy in that 1% class who stayed rich, exploiting workers, making shady one-sided deals, and using the same tactics as families like the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Sinclairs that we criticize so heavily. So I'm not really surprised that it's the same old thing, because even when Obama was a choice, people voted for him because he was the anti-war candidate when you were listening to the speeches before he was elected. And this is what they did again. They didn't want Hillary. They wanted the guy who's saying, bring the troops home and let's fix this country first. But again, that's never what we get. It's always two puppets, one hand.
Right. And this is, and this is why, I mean, I kind of just put it out as an ebook basically because I got offered a pretty good amount of money to write something on Trump.
Boom.
They wanted me to bash him, basically. They're kind of looking for why women hate Trump or whatever, which I could have done easily, but it wasn't truthful to me. I mean, I kind of thought the real story was actually what he was saying. I mean, he kind of was going against globalism. I mean, we already knew how devastating Hillary Clinton would have been anyway, so that was never any option at all. So what Trump was saying before he got elected sounded good.
Mm-hmm.
A few things, not everything, obviously, but there was enough things. But of course, when he gets in, he killed TTP right away. He was off to kind of a good start, but then boom, you kind of see it, like you said. Now it's where, yeah, it's half and half really, because we're in a position where you have the Zionist control system in there. You have a lot of things that he's either fooled everybody into, or like you said, I mean, like, yeah, you have those concerns because he is from that world, His daughter doesn't help. Kushner doesn't help.
Kushner does not help.
The people he's surrounded with doesn't help. I mean, he I don't know, man. So we'll see what happens,
Right. Well, I'm curious how you break down the power pyramid in general. It's something I used to ask quite a few guests that I kind of got away from because I just see so many competing factions, and it's a real Game of Thrones type situation as far as, what I see. But I'm curious how you break down the power pyramid. Where do you think the true power lies, especially since you have done this history in banking and trying to trace, is there a truth to American independence or not? And these types of things, the Rothschilds and their banking industry. When it comes to today, like if you try to take the past and extrapolate where it's gone, where do you think the capstone of the power pyramid is in modern times?
I think, well, okay, America is, it's the illusion. We are still free in the sense that there's things we can do here that you can't really do anywhere else.
Yeah. Our cages are much nicer than other places around the world.
Yeah, pretty much. There is opportunity here, if you're smart, and if you if you avoid, getting in, because like basically everything's about money. All like throwing you in jail for money. It's not because you're doing something wrong or whatever. It's about money. The whole system's a fraud. That is true. As far as the government or whatever, DARPA is the government. DARPA runs. I mean, that is America. DARPA runs what we think is the deep state or whatever. I mean, that is the government. Right. Period. And then you have the banking control, the Federal Reserve System, which is Rothschilds, and that sort of Anglo-American old world control system with the ability to print money based off of nothing out of thin air and sell it to everyone. Yeah. And that's that's sort of it's a Zionist. They're part of it, but they want their own. They want more control.
Right.
So there's those in faction. There's those fightings going on with them. And then
do you consider that to be is that a Jewish power network, or do you consider it to be just
Well, there's a mix, because it's like a Ziocon, because you got the old world neocon, that influence, but then you have a lot of the Jewish influence, which it just what it is, man, and then you have all the consolidation of the media companies, right? Yep. So when you have like 6 media companies owning 90% or whatever it is. And then you look at their parents, and this always goes back to the military industrial complex, like GE owns Universal, blah, blah. And so you can kind of see the chart, follow the money. So it is in that level. There is that a lot of Jewish, because you cannot deny that. You cannot say that Hollywood isn't Jewish,
Right. Disproportionately.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's right there. You can read the credits. and that doesn't mean, that's not a negative thing. That doesn't mean that's like some conspiracy or whatever. No, that's just how it is. But you have to be able to look at everything and then be like, well, wait a minute. If there's a National Security Council for president, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's 10 people or 12 people or whatever. And if 9 out of 12 people are Jewish, that might be a little concern,
Right. They might have interests that aren't typically aligned with the average American.
Right, of course. So, those are concerns that are valid.
I hear you, man. I'm with you. I definitely think they're valid. And I just try to think of the Jewish faction of the elite as I would any faction or any secret society, because the template seems to be you bring members into the group who form blood oaths to put their interests and the secrecy of their little club above all else. And then you go out in the world and you grab up as much power and influence as you can, and you help each other climb the ladder, because that's pretty much the game plan of so many little organizations, and it works. So that's how it is. And to criticize or call out a Jewish group shouldn't be any more uncomfortable than calling out a Freemasonic allegiance or something. Not all white men are Freemasons, and not all Jews are going to be members of an elite Ashkenazi Kabbalistic banking priesthood. But there is something there. There is something to that group, or maybe multiple groups of people that are of Jewish descent that are involved in banking. That is a slice of the pie that seems pretty powerful and pretty ancient based on a lot of researchers.
Exactly, and you're exactly right. So now we have a situation where through the banking, through like their choice of control, right, banking, they have control of almost what? I mean, who isn't under control of the IMF,
Right, that becomes the game. It's like, obviously Hollywood is a valuable tool, but it ain't like banking. And so you got to look at which tool is the most useful and try to do like the Russian doll thing, like which is the bigger one. And
right.
And I really do think banking has to take the cake, because everything has to be under that umbrella.
Everything is. I mean, Hollywood is a great tool for mind control and to push agendas and propaganda, which is all you see now, which makes me sick as a filmmaker and an artist. I'm sick of it, seeing it, So that's important, and that's been done since the 50s or whatever, Lookout Mountain up in Laurel Canyon, that's kind of where all those new technologies in film came from, and that's government.
Yep.
And that's what they were kind of using. All the war propaganda stuff they were creating up there. Now we all know Lookout Canyon is related to the Laurel Canyon. And then you have the Laurel Canyon conspiracy that David McGowan talked about.
Yeah.
That helped introduce these elements through music, but they were all kind of all these musicians were basically sons of fathers who were in the military industrial complex, and things like Jim Morrison's father was the admiral that got us into it was the false flag of the admiral that got us in the Gulf of Tonkin into Vietnam, and a lot of crazy things going on, Like, I don't believe in coincidence when it's like that. It's just too weird.
Right. You got to look at those connections and weigh them appropriately. Also, I wanted to circle back to that earlier question of, did America really win its independence, or did something else happen on paper behind closed doors that didn't really match the public perception? Because you have a couple interesting facts when it comes to answering that. For example, you say that the Jay Treaty had us paying the king 600 pounds sterling silver for their loss, which I really don't know how much that is, but you also note our property taxes, and it does frustrate me that when you own a home, you still have property taxes every year. It's really just like a rental, because you cannot get past that. And with all the quote-unquote debt the country is in, it really should start making more people curious about who owns this land and who really owns the Federal Reserve.
The Federal Reserve is owned by a private, a group of international bankers. I doubt very few Americans are on that board.
Mm-hmm.
And we have, man, as much as I want to say that America is, like we said earlier, we're free to a certain extent. And we have this illusion. But, the truth is, like, these guys, they were great men, these founding fathers, but they were flawed men, of course, but they were men of their times. So, yeah, it's kind of funny when, I've been reading a lot of Vonnegut recently, and Breakfast of Champions, and talk about a great writer. Very funny. I mean, for 1973, this guy's writing this stuff. Unbelievable. So he's talking about Thomas Jefferson, one of the greatest free-thinking libertarians, writing about all this, like the guy who wrote the freaking Constitution or whatever, Bill of Rights and all this stuff. And he was a slave owner. All these men were. But I think that what's lost is, they were looking at not their specific time and place. They were thinking about in the future. They knew, obviously, all the challenges they were facing. They're barely able to win that war, which is a miracle in the first place. And they still had to deal with the banking control and being hoodwinked by Hamilton and all this, right? But I think essentially what they were trying to do, because these were learned men, they were trying to lay this document for us, for future generations, to have freedom, to be completely free. And we do have a lot, and a lot more than most. I mean, the right to have guns and all this is very important. No one else has this, really, literally. So there's a lot of things that we are granted and very privileged to have and very lucky to have. But then again, we're also surrounded by bombs and traps and booby traps. And if you're black and you live in the ghetto, even worse. So you got to be smart. You got to use your mind. You got to navigate everything and try to figure out how to better yourself and to be good and live a good life. That way, next life, it'll be better for you. But the thing is, it's true, man. You never really own anything, and I discovered this from my grandfather because, my grandfather, he survived the war, was a fireman for like 30 years, right? Basically typical Americana, right?
Yeah.
He bought his house for, I think, 12 grand in the 60s, owned it completely, right? But, he ended up paying, just, on property taxes and this and that, since he owned it, probably about 8 to 10 times more than it's even worth, just over those periods of years, right?
Mm-hmm.
So think about that, man. You buy a house, 80 grand, boom. There's no incentive. There's really no incentive to own your own house if you think about it, because you pay it off, then what?
Right.
You got to pay 3 or 4 grand, 5 grand, depending on where you live every year.
Exactly.
So I would think that Trump, being a businessman or someone who wanting to do good, I would think, we can't be the first person to ever think this. How come there's no benefit for owning your house, right? If that's the so-called the American dream.
Yeah, it is a curious thing, man.
Yeah. Well, think about this. Hold on, I'm gonna cut you off. I don't mean to cut you off, but think about this.
Sure.
You buy a condo. Like my friend Buster Mathis, right? He fought Mike Tyson. He got bombed on from Mike Tyson for a couple of rounds. They gave him like 800 grand, which is great. Hell yeah. But I just said by the time the government and Don King, everybody got their cut, he had maybe 300,000 left. So he bought a condo in Coconut Grove. Sweet place. Owned it outright, right?
Right.
Well, then, everything kind of dried up, and they have these HOA fees, like maintenance fees, right? Homeowners association fees.
Mm-hmm.
They want to charge you ridiculous amounts of money, 500 or 1,000 or whatever it is. So after a period of not paying for a few months, then you suddenly owe them association fees. Now you owe them like 2 grand or 3 grand or whatever it is. And then all of a sudden, since you didn't pay all those association fees, guess what? That gives them the excuse to steal your apartment or your condo.
Right.
So they literally took his place just because, he was behind on some a place that he owned outright. And that happens a lot. And the whole thing of those big condos, why they're all empty, is because they want to get you in there and then apply you with these HOA fees to the point where eventually you won't be able to afford it. And then they steal it from you. And that's how they do it. And same thing with houses. You can own your house, but the minute you go a couple months behind on whatever, someone will take it from you.
Yeah. And you got to pay the master. It just never ends. You can't get outside of it.
You can. It's impossible.
Yeah. You just got to make enough money for yourself that you can break them off and it doesn't bother you that much. That's the best you can do. That's all you can do.
Yeah, that's it. Anything to avoid going to jail.
Exactly.
Oh
So,
man.
man, to switch gears a little bit, I also wanted to talk to you about your book on giants. Of course, every conspiracy show under the sun has talked about the huge number of giant skeletons and bones found in early America, but you write about actual encounters the conquistadors had with living giants, which is talked about far less and is pretty provocative. What can you tell us about this?
Oh man, that's my favorite part of the Giants is talking about the conquistadors. They have firsthand accounts, which are fabulous, and it's true. We always kind of read about anything but these, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to go into and find, like, for instance, Amerigo Vespucci, his account, which is incredible. He's the one that they named the Americas after, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Spanish conquistador from Verona. So he goes and he's looking at the island of Curacao, which is off the coast of Venezuela. And they land, and they see these big footprints, and they're kind of like, these are pretty bigger than normal, bigger than usual footprints. And he follows them up, and he ends up into a little village where he finds some very tall women. And now the women of the tribe were bigger than they were. These little conquistadors probably like 5'4", 5'5", whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So they're kind of figuring out how can we take a couple of these girls back to the ship with us, right? Well, when they were formulating this plot, in came the giant men of the tribe. And they were like, okay. Because these guys were like 9 foot tall. So they were like, okay, let's rethink this. So they kind of just backed up slowly and got out of there, right? They fired off a couple cannons, to scare them when they're going away. So anyways, and he names the Curacao the Island of Giants.
Yeah.
Boom. Pretty cool.
It is, man. And I could be wrong, but I think this, from your book, I wrote it down as an Americo Vespucci story. But there was this one encounter where they pull up on a naked giant just dancing, and they take him to, like, their leader or whatever, and they're trying to communicate, and he's trying to figure out where these conquistadors would have came from, this giant is, and he points to the sky. He's like, "Did you guys come from the sky?" And it's like, what the fuck? Why would he make that assumption? Not point like across the ocean, perhaps, or really anywhere but up in the sky, because at that time there should be nothing coming from the sky.
Well, it's fabulous you brought that up. I think that is either Magellan or
Oh, it is Magellan. It is Magellan.
yeah, where they go down to Patagonia, and that's okay when they get down to the bottom of Argentina and they get towards the Arctic, and that's when they're finding these huge, and we actually have pictures of this because they were sort of the last live giants that they discovered. So there's pictures, of these massive 9-10 foot tall Patagonian giants, and they were kind of like ape-like, pretty much dancing around and throwing dung, and they weren't too bright. Yeah. So you have those live giants, but then you have the other giants with, mentioning the fact that pointing to the sky. Now this is very interesting because Columbus was asked the same thing. Now Columbus actually had a UFO sighting before he reached shores. They saw the orbs. So he had a UFO sighting that was actually sort of a USO because it kind of went into the water. And then when he actually met the Taino Indians, the first thing they asked him is he was from the sky.
Yeah.
I think this happened to Bizarro too. Same thing. Like, why are they asking you if you're from the sky, right? If supposedly nothing's flying around. Now, this is kind of interesting because it relates to the cargo cult and the John Frum story.
Mm-hmm.
You familiar with that?
A little bit, but tell the people for anyone who isn't.
Okay, well, John Frum was an African-American fighter pilot during World War II, and he crash landed in the area down in the South Pacific, near the Papua New Guinea.
Mm-hmm.
So he survived it, and when he left, the Aborigines there, because he looked like them, thought he was like a god. So they constructed, a big plane, right? They had festivals for him. They kind of imitated him. He was like their god. So they worshipped him. And this guy was just a fighter pilot who crash landed. So if that happened in the 40s, if it happened 1,000 years ago, it kind of why would it change?
Yeah, it could be a very parallel type of story.
Right. So the fact that you got natives asking if you come from the sky, basically saying they saw something fly in the sky. what was flying in the sky? That's the question.
Right. It's a curious thing, man. And yeah, like you mentioned the Patagonia stuff, which I thought was really interesting because I'm always down for anything involving Antarctica, especially now. It's a very interesting place because it is so huge and underexplored. You got Lockheed Martin down there. You got treaties that say you can't go there without really serious permission from very important organizations. So it is odd to hear about something like giants down there because who knows what they might find. There might be ruins down there. There might be all kinds of stuff. It's
Yes.
conspiracy. The rumors circulate. But to have those pictures of the Ona tribe down there, I thought that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's cool. And exactly, if these super tall natives, which are, I mean, they're right there in the Arctic, basically. So if they were still around, who knows what's actually down in Antarctica, which has always been mysterious. I had a friend who was down there, stationed down there, and I guess he was working at Lake Vostok, which that really doesn't get mentioned about, but it was really important. One of the lakes that they actually found, deep water living organisms and like crazy cold water. So Lake Vostok has been very interesting. They've known about that since at least the early 2000s. Now you have all the rumors going on. Did they find an Atlantis or something? So it's interesting because we know certain things happen. Like we know there was an Operation High Jump. We know Admiral Byrd went over there, and I've always kind of believed that in the Earth, like the Hollow Earth, right?
Yeah, that's my shit right there.
Yeah, me too, man. That's like I've always thought that was. I thought the whole flat Earth thing is just a distraction, so you don't actually learn about the Hollow Earth. So the Hollow Earth, very interesting, especially when you got Admiral Byrd flying over parts that weren't frozen, that had vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
So what's that about? And then, like you said, there's areas you're not allowed to go to. So, who really knows? We can't really be tourists because we don't have access to certain places.
Right.
Like all the cool places we can't go to, like in Cuba, for example. I lived in Guantanamo Bay when I was a teenager, right? And our teacher used to tell us about how there was pyramids and stuff in the mountains, in the Sierra Madres, the areas like you're not allowed to go in, basically. They had found,
Damn.
yeah, and which is very interesting because you have supposedly, if you go in the top part of Cuba, a little bit off on the northern side, they found some scientists. I think it was Canadian and Russian scientists found some submerged buildings that look like some Mayan temples and stuff. So
damn.
Yeah, and then there's no update. They're not allowed to explore any further, right? Because it blows the whole thing wide open. If you have Mayan temples or whatever and actual Mayan pyramids in Cuba, it might mean that those things are actually older and not even built by the Maya. They could be from a time when the Caribbean was higher, right?
True.
And that kind of goes into like the whole idea that there was an asteroid that kind of hit off North Carolina.
Yeah, in the Younger Dryas period.
Exactly, yes. Something happened.
About 12,800 years ago.
Yep. So that's why they're kind of trying to say now, like, oh, there's humans here 100,000 years ago or something in California, which is interesting. But like, how come they don't talk about the footprints and the ashes and the volcanic ashes or whatever, like, that are super old that they found in Mexico? And the U.S. Army came in and said because they found some carvings in a mastodon bone or something. And they found some evidence that appeared that there were humans there over 250,000 years ago. They just kind of shut it down. This is in the 70s, so they know. They know. It's just that control. And it goes back to keeping this lie of evolution and keeping the Royal Academies and keeping this constructed narrative of their false timeline of history in check, man. They got to keep it. So that's the only thing, Nothing will disturb that, right? So they have to make sure. And this is why the Giants get no love, They kind of, despite every culture in the world and every history and all the Bible and everything, it's just nothing but giants. But
well, that's the thing, man. I mean, this is amazing stuff. There's clearly something there, but these giants seem to be everywhere. Just a couple hundred years ago, based on these stories, could all trace really have been wiped away that easily if they did exist so recently? It seems odd that we can't find any.
Exactly. And this is kind of, okay, just going off biblical stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
The giants were created, they weren't created, they were the offspring of the relations of the angels, right? Like the fallen angels.
Right.
They were, okay, let's take it back. First of all, there was the creation of these races, the Adama or whatever, Adama, whatever, because it's the Adam. Like, it wasn't like one person, it was like a race.
Genetic engineering, is that the kind of thing? Like,
yeah, exactly. It's genetic engineering. And one of the first races was the Adams and Eves, so to speak, right? But then they were given this sort of knowledge by the Reptilian, and God got mad, so he punished them, so he left them out in the world, punished them. But then the problem was the angels were like, damn, these Eves are kind of hot. So they started playing around with them, and they were
grabbing them by the pussy.
Doing the Trump tactic, So basically, they were giving birth to the giants, but then the giants were kind of like cannibalistic. They weren't very good. So it caused like the gods to be like, yo, we got to, this experiment has gone long enough, and it's just, we got to get rid of these assholes, basically.
And that cannibalistic element is consistent with the stories from Native Americans and the people who saw these actual giants, right?
I was just about to say, it's very interesting to have the same thing in the Native American histories about these cannibalistic giants, and that they were destroyed specifically because the Great Spirit was tired of the shit. So, same thing in the biblical. So we have this collective consciousness of very wicked giants messing shit up and needing to be destroyed. And that's kind of what happened. So, after this, we know that all of them couldn't have possibly died, because even in the Bible, there were still giants they had to go kill, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were still Goliath, there were still the sons of Anak, right? When Moses is making his way to the promised land, and his little scouts come back and says, like, yo, bro, we got a problem. Jerusalem looks cool and all, but there's the sons of Anak, how are we going to beat them? They're a bunch of giants, so a lot of part of the Bible is figuring out how to get rid of the pesky giants that actually survived.
Huh.
So if those ones survived, what's to say that all the way across, in the Western Hemisphere, they wouldn't survive too? Obviously they did, because we found evidence of it, right? First person accounts. But the thing is, we're kind of looking for the real giants, like 15, 20 foot, all this stuff.
Yeah.
I don't think, there was ever sort of like a 30-foot giant. 20 foot is kind of stretching as well. I guess it depends on what point in history with the atmosphere, because we know certain types of history, there's certain atmospheres that, giant things are bigger, right?
Right. It changed. Like the dinosaurs couldn't exist in the current environment we have. It had to be different at that time. So it could have had giant people too.
Exactly. So I think at some point, there could have been a more giant based on that. And I think what happens is, just like anything in genetics, you have, because a lot of the native, like when they encountered the giant chiefs, most of the chiefs were giants, 9 foot, 10 feet. Very astounding, right? To these, to the conquistadors. And it was because it was selective breeding, right? So it was keeping that, because the giants, because usually it goes to semi-divine, divine, right? And keep the bloodline, So the taller ones, they had been part of keeping the bloodline together, and that's kind of why there were still some left. Because not all of them were giants. And a lot of times you'll find most, especially in the mounds, when they start digging up the mounds and everything, most of the Indians were about 7.5 feet tall, still very tall. So, it's a good indicator of that. They were kind of related, and they still had these DNA and these genetics of this ancient race. And we have giants now, like 7-footers. I'm watching the playoffs, and a lot of tall dudes out there. So the idea that the giant is nothing but a myth or a fairy tale is just complete nonsense.
Yeah. And, your book is full of those great newspaper clippings from early America that describe the giant bone findings. And there are just so many of them. I wanted to read this one as an example because it is from the New York Times in 1886. It says, Cartersville, Georgia. The water has receded from the Tumlin Mound Field and has left uncovered acres of skulls and bones. Some of these are gigantic. If the whole frame is in proportion to the 2 thigh bones that were found, their owner must have stood 14 feet tall. Many curious ornaments of shell, brass, and stone have been found. Some of the bodies were buried in small vaults made of stone. A representative from the Smithsonian is here investigating the curious relics. So that one hits on all the high points. I mean, 14 feet tall, and of course it gives the Smithsonian a mention for good measure, which was a big part of the story too. But I like that one.
That's a great one, and it basically illustrates the fact that the Smithsonian always, they usually end with the Smithsonian showing up, or we shipped off the bones to the Smithsonian, you know, and then you never heard from again.
Amen, man. Well, this has been a blast, man.